You know that moment when you're lying in bed at 2 a.m. and your mind starts wandering through all the paths you didn't take? All the tiny choices that seemed meaningless at the time, but somehow led you here. What if I told you that right now, as you listen to this, you're living inside the echo of 7 decisions you barely remember making? Tiny decisions, butterfly wings, entire worlds changed. If this thought settles something restless in your mind, if you want to return to this calm space whenever the world feels too loud, subscribe to The Quiet Mind so you never lose this peace before sleep again. Tonight, we're going to trace the invisible threads that connect your smallest moments to your biggest transformations. And by the end, you might see your life completely differently. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever held a butterfly in your cupped hands? I did once, as a child. A monarch, wings like stained glass windows, resting so lightly I could barely feel its presence. My grandmother whispered, "Be gentle. Something that small can change everything." I didn't understand her then. Now, I think she was talking about more than butterflies.
The ancient wisdom of maybe. There's a story the ancient Taoists tell about a farmer whose horse ran away. His neighbor said, "How terrible!" The farmer replied, "Maybe." The next day, the horse returned with 7 wild horses. "How wonderful," they said. "Maybe," said the farmer. His son tried to tame one of the wild horses and broke his leg. "How terrible." "Maybe." Then war came, and because of his broken leg, the son wasn't drafted into the army. Maybe, maybe, maybe. Every story balanced on the edge of maybe. The mathematics of chaos. In 1972, a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz was running weather simulations on his computer. He wanted to rerun one particular sequence, but instead of entering the full number 0.506127, he rounded it to 0.506. Just 3 decimal places, a difference smaller than a whisper. The entire weather pattern transformed. Completely different storms, different sunny days, an entirely alternate atmospheric reality, born from 0.000127. That's when we first glimpsed the mathematics behind what poets had always known. Small things matter infinitely. They called it the butterfly effect, the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could trigger a tornado in Texas. The weather patterns of our lives. But here's what the scientists didn't fully grasp then, and what the ancient wisdom keepers always understood. This isn't just about weather patterns. It's about the weather patterns of our lives, the tiny atmospheric pressures of choice and chance that create the storms and sunshine of who we become. Think about it. Right now, at this moment, how did you end up here, listening to these words, in this place, at this exact time? Was it the algorithm that suggested this video? Was it the sleepless night that made you search for something calming? Was it the argument you had yesterday that left you seeking peace? Or maybe, was it something that happened 20 years ago that you've completely forgotten? The train that changed everything. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's not her real name, but her story is entirely real. Sarah was running late for work one Tuesday morning in 2019. She missed her usual train by 30 seconds. 30 seconds that felt like failure, like the universe conspiring against her. She caught the next train, sat in a different car, next to a different person. That person was reading a book about sustainable architecture. They struck up a conversation. By the time they reached downtown, she had a business card and a completely different perspective on her career as a graphic designer. 6 months later, she quit her corporate job. A year later, she was designing eco-friendly homes. 2 years later, she met her future partner at a green building conference. 3 years later, they adopted a daughter from foster care. All because she missed a train by 30 seconds. The neuroscience of small changes. Now imagine if we could trace every thread, every tiny decision that cascaded into the shape of your current life. What would we find? The neuroscientists have a term for this: sensitive dependence on initial conditions. But the Zen masters said it more beautifully: the whole universe is contained in a single grain of sand. Your life is that grain of sand. And every small decision you've made, every seemingly insignificant choice, is both the grain and the universe it contains. There's something profound happening in your brain right now as you listen to this. Your neural pathways are literally reshaping themselves, forming new connections based on these ideas. The very act of contemplating the butterfly effect creates its own butterfly effect in the architecture of your mind.
Dr. Michael Merzenich, one of the pioneers of neuroplasticity research, discovered that our brains remain malleable throughout our entire lives. Every new thought, every moment of reflection creates tiny changes in our neural networks. So this moment, you, here, considering the weight of small decisions, is itself creating small changes that could ripple forward in ways you'll never fully trace. The ancient Greeks had 2 words for time: chronos, clock time, measured and predictable, and kairos, the right moment, the perfect timing, the fullness of time where possibility lives. Your small decisions happen in chronos, but their effects unfold in kairos. That conversation with a stranger, that book you almost didn't buy, that left turn instead of right, that moment you chose to speak up or chose to stay quiet, that day you decided to try something new, or that day you decided to play it safe. All of these live in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, in the eternal now where butterfly wings meet infinite possibility. But here's what might surprise you most. The 7 decisions we're about to explore, most of them don't feel like decisions at all when they're happening. They feel like accidents, like random moments, like life just unfolding. And maybe that's the most beautiful part of the butterfly effect. Maybe the most powerful choices we make are the ones that don't feel like choices at all. The first of these invisible decisions happens before you even realize you're deciding anything. It's so ordinary, so automatic, that you might have made it a dozen times today without noticing. But that first tiny choice, the one we almost never pay attention to, might be the one that changes everything else. What did you notice first when you woke up this morning? I'm serious. Before you reach for your phone, before you check the time, before your mind filled with the day's obligations, what was the very first thing that caught your attention? This might seem like the smallest possible question, but it's not. That first moment of noticing, where you place your attention when consciousness returns, sets the gravitational field for your entire day. And over time, the gravitational field for your entire life. The Buddha spent years studying this, not in temples or monasteries initially, but in the raw laboratory of his own awakening mind. He discovered something that modern neuroscience has only recently begun to understand. Attention is not passive. It's not a spotlight that randomly illuminates whatever happens to be there. Attention is sculptural. It shapes reality by choosing what to carve away and what to keep. Dr. Michael Posner at the University of Oregon has spent decades mapping the neural networks of attention. His research reveals something extraordinary. The simple act of focusing your attention on something, anything, literally changes the physical structure of your brain within days. Where you place your attention, neural pathways strengthen. Where you don't, they fade. You are quite literally sculpting your own consciousness with every moment of focus.
let me tell you about the first tiny decision that changed everything for Marcus, a man I met years ago during my own journey through chronic insomnia. Marcus had spent 3 years waking up and immediately reaching for his phone. Email, news, social media, the endless scroll of other people's emergencies and opinions. This seemed normal. Everyone did it. But one morning in November, his phone was dead. He'd forgotten to plug it in. Instead of the familiar blue glow, he noticed sunlight filtering through his bedroom window. Really noticed it. The way it caught dust particles dancing in the air like tiny stars. The way shadows fell across the hardwood floor in geometric patterns. For maybe 30 seconds, he just watched the light. That's all. 30 seconds of attention placed on light instead of screens. He told me later that this was the moment his depression began to lift. Not dramatically, not immediately, but something had shifted in that half minute of noticing. The Stoics understood this intimately. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." Your way of thinking is your way of attending. Epictetus taught that we cannot control external events, but we have complete sovereignty over where we place our attention. He called this the discipline of desire, learning to want what happens by choosing how we perceive what happens. Have you ever had one of these moments where a simple shift in attention changed everything? Share it below. I read every single comment. Here's what's happening in your brain when you make these tiny choices about attention. The prefrontal cortex, your brain's executive center, is constantly filtering millions of bits of sensory information. Right now, it's ignoring the feeling of your clothes against your skin, the ambient sounds in your room, the temperature of the air, the taste in your mouth. It has to. Otherwise, you'd be overwhelmed into paralysis. But what it chooses to let through, that becomes your reality. This is why two people can experience the exact same event and come away with completely different stories. They weren't attending to the same details. They were sculpting different realities from the same raw material. Back to Marcus and his morning light. That single moment of noticing began a cascade he never could have predicted. The next morning, he intentionally left his phone in another room, spent 5 minutes watching the light again. Within a week, he'd bought a small notebook and started writing down what he noticed each morning. Not grand insights or life-changing revelations, just details. The color of the sky, the sound of birds, the way his coffee steamed. 6 months later, he was writing poetry. A year later, he left his corporate job to become a freelance writer. 2 years later, he published a collection of poems called Morning Light that helped thousands of people struggling with depression. All from 30 seconds of attention placed on dancing dust and sunlight. But here's the paradox the ancient masters knew. The more deliberately you try to control your attention, the more elusive it becomes. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. This is why meditation isn't about forcing your mind to focus. It's about learning to notice, with gentle curiosity, where your attention naturally wants to go. And then, without judgment, offering it something better. The Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi called this "don't know mind," the spacious awareness that doesn't need to grasp or control, but simply receives whatever arises with equal presence. Dr. Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School used MRI technology to study the brains of long-term meditators. She discovered that regions associated with attention and sensory processing were significantly thicker in meditators than in control groups.
But here's the remarkable part. These changes occurred in people who meditated for just 27 minutes a day for 8 weeks. 27 minutes of choosing where to place attention, daily, for 2 months, and the physical structure of their brains had transformed. If attention can reshape neural tissue in 8 weeks, imagine what it's done to your life over years and decades. Think about your own patterns of attention. Where does your mind automatically go when you have a quiet moment? What do you notice first when you enter a room? What captures your focus when you're walking down the street? These aren't random habits. They're the invisible architecture of your experience. The tiny gravitational fields that pull your consciousness in particular directions. And here's the beautiful secret. You can change them. Not through force or willpower, but through the gentle, persistent practice of noticing. The second tiny decision that shapes everything is so subtle you might miss it entirely. It happens in the space between noticing and responding, in the pause between stimulus and reaction. Most people skip right over this pause. It's barely a heartbeat long. But in that microsecond of space lives the difference between living reactively and living deliberately. The ancient traditions called this space by many names. The Stoics called it the discipline of action. The Buddhists called it the gap. Modern psychology calls it response flexibility. But I think the most beautiful name comes from the Taoists. They called it the space where the river changes direction. And once you learn to recognize this space in your own experience, once you learn to live inside this pause, everything else begins to shift in ways you never imagined possible. Right now, as you listen to these words, something miraculous is happening. Between this breath and the next, there's a pause. Not an absence, not emptiness, but a space full of infinite possibility. Take a breath with me. A real one. Not the shallow, automatic breathing we do all day, but a conscious breath. In and out. Did you feel it? That tiny gap between exhale and inhale? That moment when your body is perfectly still, balanced between empty and full. The ancient yogis built entire philosophies around this pause. They called it kumbhaka, the retention of breath. But they weren't just talking about breathing technique. They were talking about the space where choice lives. Every moment of your life exists between stimulus and response. Something happens. You react. But in between those two events, in a space smaller than a heartbeat, lies your sovereignty, your freedom, your power to choose who you become. Viktor Frankl discovered this space in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. In the Nazi concentration camps, stripped of everything, possessions, dignity, hope, he realized there was one thing they couldn't take from him: the space between what happened to him and how he chose to respond to it. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." Let me tell you about Elena, a teacher who discovered this space during the most ordinary moment imaginable. She was standing in line at the grocery store, exhausted after a long day, when the person in front of her began arguing loudly with the cashier about a coupon. Elena felt her chest tighten, her jaw clench, her mind immediately spinning into irritation and judgment. But then, pause. For just a moment, she stepped back from her automatic reaction and noticed it happening. The anger rising, the story her mind was creating about inconsiderate people and their petty problems. And in that tiny space of noticing, she had a choice. She could feed the irritation, let it grow into full-blown anger, carry it home to her family, spread it like a virus through her evening, or she could breathe. She could choose curiosity instead of judgment. She could wonder what kind of day the person in front of her was having, what stress or pain might be driving their behavior. This shift took maybe 3 seconds. From irritation to curiosity, from reaction to response. The person in front of her continued arguing. The situation didn't change, but Elena's experience of it transformed completely. Instead of going home carrying stress, she went home carrying compassion. Instead of snapping at her kids about homework, she listened to their stories from school. Instead of mindlessly scrolling her phone after dinner, she read them a bedtime story that sparked a conversation about kindness. 3 seconds in a grocery store line, an entire evening transformed. Have you ever caught yourself in one of these moments? That pause before reacting? I'd love to hear how it changed things for you. Dr. Daniel Siegel, a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, has spent years studying what he calls the window of tolerance. That space where we can observe our emotions without being overwhelmed by them. His research shows that when we learn to recognize this pause, our brains literally rewire themselves. The connection between the amygdala, our alarm system, and the prefrontal cortex, our wise observer, strengthens. We become less reactive and more responsive, less automatic and more intentional. But here's what's remarkable. This rewiring doesn't require years of meditation or therapy. It happens every time you catch yourself in that pause and make a conscious choice. The Stoics called this prosoch, continuous attention to the present moment. Not meditation in the formal sense, but a way of living that recognizes every moment as an opportunity to practice wisdom. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius, "Every new thing excites the mind, but a mind that seeks the truth turns from the new to the eternal." What he meant was this: instead of being pulled around by every stimulus, every emotion, every external event, we can learn to turn toward the eternal space within ourselves where choice lives. This space between stimulus and response shows up everywhere in your life. When someone cuts you off in traffic, when you receive criticism at work, when your plans fall apart, when good news arrives, when disappointment strikes. Each time, there's a pause, a breath, a space where you can ask yourself, how do I want to respond to this? What kind of person do I want to be in this moment? The Tibetan Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls this the gap. She teaches that enlightenment isn't about becoming perfect or eliminating difficult emotions. It's about learning to rest in the gap between trigger and reaction. Elena began noticing this space everywhere. When her principal criticized her lesson plans, instead of immediately defending herself, she paused. What was actually being said? What could she learn? How could she respond from wisdom instead of wounded ego? When her teenage daughter came home angry about friendship drama, instead of jumping into problem-solving mode or dismissing her feelings, Elena paused. What did her daughter actually need right now? Advice? Or just someone to listen? When she found herself doom-scrolling social media late at night, instead of continuing on autopilot, she paused. What was she actually looking for? Connection? Distraction from something uncomfortable? And was this the best way to meet that need? The ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi told a story about a butcher who could carve an ox without dulling his blade.
When asked how this was possible, the butcher replied, "I follow the natural structure of the ox. I place my blade in the empty spaces between joints. Where there is no resistance, the knife glides effortlessly." This is what living in the pause teaches us. Instead of forcing our way through life, reacting against every obstacle, we learn to find the spaces where there is no resistance, the gaps between stimulus and response, where wisdom naturally resides.
But here's something most people don't realize about this space. It's not just about managing difficult emotions or stressful situations. This pause is also where joy lives, where love lives, where creativity and inspiration arise. When you see a beautiful sunset and feel that moment of awe, there's a pause before your mind labels it, categorizes it, moves on to the next thing. In that pause, you touch something infinite. When you look into someone's eyes and feel a moment of deep connection, there's a pause before self-consciousness or social conditioning kicks in. In that pause, you remember what love actually is. When was the last time you felt truly present? Not thinking about the past or planning the future, but completely here in this moment. I bet if you remember carefully, it happened in one of these pauses. The third tiny decision that changes everything is even more subtle than the first two. It happens not in how you notice or how you pause, but in what you choose to believe about what you notice. Every experience comes with a story. Your mind is constantly narrating, interpreting, making meaning from the raw data of sensation and circumstance. But here's what the great wisdom traditions discovered and what modern cognitive science has confirmed. You are not stuck with your mind's first interpretation of events. You can choose which story to believe. You can rewrite the narrative as it's happening. And this choice, which story you believe about your life, might be the most powerful butterfly wing of all, because the story you tell yourself about what's happening becomes what's actually happening. But this choice is so automatic, so invisible, that most people never realize they're making it at all. Every morning you wake up and begin telling yourself a story. Not consciously, not deliberately, but constantly. The story of who you are, what today means, what your life adds up to, what's possible and what's not. Right now, as you listen to these words, part of your mind is already constructing a narrative about this experience. This is helpful. This is too slow. I should be sleeping. I need to remember this. This reminds me of. But here's the profound secret the ancient storytellers knew and that modern narrative therapy has rediscovered. You are both the author and the main character of your life story, and the version you choose to tell becomes the version you live. Dr. Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia has spent decades studying what he calls story editing, our unconscious ability to reframe the narratives we tell about our experiences. His research reveals something extraordinary. People who learn to consciously reshape their life stories show measurable improvements in mental health, academic performance, and life satisfaction that persist for months or even years. Not through denying reality or positive thinking, but through choosing which true aspects of their experience to emphasize. Let me tell you about two people who experienced the exact same event, but chose completely different stories about what it meant. James and Maria both lost their jobs on the same day at the same company during a round of layoffs. Same circumstance, same external reality. James told himself this story. I'm a failure. The economy is rigged against people like me. I'm too old to start over. This proves I'm not as capable as I thought. My career is probably over. Maria told herself this story. This is terrifying,
But maybe it's also an opportunity. I've been unhappy at this job for months, but too scared to leave. Now the universe is pushing me towards something new. I have skills and experience. This could be the catalyst I needed.
Same facts, different stories, and within 6 months, completely different realities. James spent 3 months in a depression that affected his relationships, his health, his confidence in interviews. When he finally found another job, it was at a lower salary, doing work he didn't enjoy. Maria spent those same 3 months networking, taking an online course, reconnecting with her creativity. She started freelance consulting and within a year had built a business that earned more than her previous salary while giving her the flexibility she'd always wanted. Now, I'm not suggesting that positive thinking magically changes circumstances. Life contains genuine tragedy, real loss, systemic injustices that individual reframing cannot eliminate. But within the constraints of what actually happens to us, we have extraordinary freedom to choose what those events mean. And the meaning we choose shapes what becomes possible next. The Stoics understood this deeply. They distinguished between what they called impressions, the raw facts of what happens, and judgments, the stories we tell about what happens. Epictetus taught, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. But this wasn't about denying difficult emotions or pretending everything is fine. It was about recognizing your power to choose your interpretation of events. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in his private journal, practiced this constantly. Today, I escaped from anxiety. Or no, I discarded it because it was within me, in my own perceptions, not outside. Have you ever reframed a difficult experience and found it completely changed your relationship to it? I'd love to hear your story below. Dr. James Pennerbaker at the University of Texas has conducted groundbreaking research on expressive writing, the practice of writing about difficult experiences with a focus on meaning-making rather than just emotional venting. His studies show that people who spend just 15 to 20 minutes for 3 consecutive days writing about challenging experiences while actively trying to understand and find meaning in them show improved immune function, better mental health, higher grades in students, even fewer visits to the doctor. The act of consciously choosing your story about difficult experiences literally changes your biology.
Let me tell you about Rachel, who discovered the power of story choosing during the darkest period of her life. At 35, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. For months, she lived inside the story of betrayal, her body betraying her, her future stolen, her dreams impossible. This story was true. Her diagnosis was real. Her symptoms were real. Her grief was justified. But it wasn't the only true story available. One evening, unable to sleep, Rachel started writing in a journal, not about her illness, but about what it had already taught her, how it had clarified what actually mattered, how it had deepened her relationships with people who truly cared, how it had eliminated the anxiety she used to carry about trivial social judgments. She began to see her diagnosis not as the end of her story, but as the beginning of a different chapter. A chapter about resilience, about presence, about the fierce preciousness of ordinary moments. This isn't magical thinking or denial. Rachel still had MS. She still faced real challenges and limitations. But by consciously choosing to emphasize different true aspects of her experience, the growth, the clarity, the deeper relationships, she changed what became possible within her circumstances. The Buddhist teacher Tara Brach calls this radical acceptance, not passive resignation, but the active embrace of reality as it is, combined with conscious choice about what meaning to make from it. Here's how this works in everyday life. When you get stuck in traffic, you can choose the story of frustration and wasted time, or the story of unexpected quiet moments to breathe and think. When a relationship ends, you can choose the story of rejection and failure, or the story of lessons learned and space created for something better aligned. When you make a mistake at work, you can choose the story of incompetence and shame, or the story of learning and humanness. The neuroscientist Dr. Michael Gazzaniga discovered that our brains contain what he calls the interpreter, a part of our consciousness that constantly creates explanatory narratives for our experiences. This interpreter never stops working. It's always telling stories about why things happen, what they mean, how they connect to everything else. The profound realization is this: if your brain is going to create stories anyway, you might as well consciously participate in choosing which stories get emphasized. But here's where this gets really interesting. The stories you choose don't just change your experience of the present, they literally reshape your past and future. When you reframe a painful experience as a source of wisdom, you retroactively transform that pain into something meaningful. The past event remains the same, but its meaning in your life story changes. And when you choose empowering stories about your current circumstances, you create different expectations about what's possible, which influences the actions you take, which creates different results. The fourth tiny decision that changes everything happens in the stories you tell about other people, not to them, but to yourself about them. Every person you encounter comes with a story in your mind: parent, stranger, partner, boss, friend, enemy. But here's what most people never realize. The story you tell yourself about someone else changes who they become in relation to you. And sometimes it even changes who they become in relation to themselves. This fourth butterfly wing, the stories we choose about the people in our lives, might create the most unexpected transformations of all.
Every person in your life is living inside the story you tell about them. Not just in your mind, in the space between you, in the invisible field of expectation and assumption that surrounds every relationship. Think about someone you love deeply. When you imagine them, what story do you see? Capable, growing, wise, struggling but resilient. Now think about someone who frustrates you. What story do you carry about them? Selfish, incompetent, stuck, hopeless? Here's what the ancient wisdom traditions knew, and what modern psychology is just beginning to understand. The story you believe about someone becomes the story they have to live up to or live down to when they're with you. Dr. Robert Rosenthal at Harvard conducted one of the most famous studies in psychology, known as the Pygmalion effect. Teachers were told that certain students had been identified as intellectual bloomers who would show significant improvement that year. In reality, these students were chosen completely at random. By the end of the year, the randomly selected students had indeed shown significantly greater improvement than their classmates. The only difference? The story their teachers believed about their potential. But this goes far beyond classroom dynamics. Every relationship exists inside these invisible stories we tell about each other. Your partner lives inside your story of who they are and what they're capable of. Your children grow into the stories you believe about their nature and potential. Your coworkers respond to the stories you carry about their competence and intentions. Even strangers you encounter for 30 seconds are influenced by whether you see them as fundamentally good, struggling, worthy of patience and respect.
Let me tell you about David and his relationship with his teenage son, Alex. For 2 years, their interactions had devolved into constant conflict. David saw Alex as irresponsible, lazy, disrespectful. Alex seemed to confirm this story daily, forgetting chores, arguing about homework, spending hours on video games. David carried the story that Alex was becoming a problem child who needed constant correction and control. One evening, exhausted by another argument,
David found himself remembering Alex as a 5-year-old, curious, creative, building elaborate structures with blocks, asking endless questions about how things worked. In that moment, David realized something profound. He'd been so focused on correcting Alex's behavior that he'd forgotten to see Alex's essence. What if Alex wasn't lazy but overwhelmed by social pressures David couldn't see? What if his disrespect was actually a clumsy attempt to establish autonomy? What if his retreat into video games was his way of finding competence and connection in a world that felt increasingly demanding? David decided to experiment with a different story. Instead of seeing Alex as a problem to be solved, he chose to see him as a person figuring out how to be human in challenging circumstances. Instead of leading with criticism, David started noticing things Alex did well. Instead of focusing on what was wrong, he began asking questions about Alex's inner experience. That game you're playing looks complex. What do you like about it? You seem stressed lately. What's going on in school? I noticed you helped your sister with her project yesterday. That was kind. Within weeks, something shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually. Alex began responding to the new story David was telling about him. When someone sees you as capable, you're more likely to act capably. When someone sees you as fundamentally good, you're more likely to behave in ways that confirm that goodness. Have you ever experienced this shift? Someone changing how they saw you and it changing how you saw yourself? Share your experience below. The quantum physicist John Wheeler proposed something called the participatory universe. The idea that consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it participates in creating it. This isn't mystical thinking. It's increasingly supported by research in quantum mechanics, showing that the act of observation influences what is observed. But you don't need quantum physics to understand this. You can see it in every relationship. When you assume someone is trustworthy, you create space for their trustworthiness to emerge. When you assume someone is hostile, you create conditions where their defensiveness is likely to appear. The Taoists called this Wu Wei, action that arises naturally from seeing clearly, rather than forcing from expectations. When you see someone's essential nature, rather than their temporary behaviors, you create space for that nature to express itself. The Buddha taught something similar. If you want to know your mind of the past, look at your present body. If you want to know your mind of the future, look at your present actions. But he might have added, if you want to know someone's future potential, look at the story you're telling about them in the present. This principle doesn't just apply to close relationships. It influences every human interaction. When you approach a service worker with the story that they're doing their best under difficult circumstances, you're more likely to receive helpful service than if you approach with the story that they're incompetent or don't care. When you enter a business meeting carrying the story that everyone wants the project to succeed, even if they have different ideas about how, you create different energy than if you assume people are trying to sabotage or compete. When you encounter someone driving aggressively, you can choose the story of an inconsiderate person who doesn't respect others, or the story of someone having an emergency, running late for something important, or dealing with stress you can't see. Here's what's remarkable. Changing your story about someone doesn't require them to know about it, agree with it, or even be present. Sarah, a manager at a tech company, was struggling with an employee named Mike who seemed constantly negative and resistant to new ideas. Every team meeting became a source of tension. Instead of continuing to see Mike as the problem employee, Sarah began wondering, what if Mike's resistance came from expertise and concern for quality? What if his questions, which she'd been experiencing as obstruction, were actually attempts to prevent problems she hadn't considered? She started approaching their interactions with curiosity rather than frustration. Mike, I know you have concerns about this approach. What do you think we should watch out for? Within a month, Mike transformed from the team's skeptic to their most valuable quality assurance resource. Not because he changed, but because the story Sarah told about his behavior changed, which changed how she interacted with him, which allowed different aspects of his personality to emerge. But here's the most profound part. This isn't manipulation or technique, it's recognition. When you choose empowering stories about people, you're not imposing false beliefs. You're choosing to see potentials and qualities that were always there but perhaps dormant or hidden. Every person contains multitudes. The angry person also has capacity for kindness. The lazy person also has areas where they're passionate and energetic. The difficult person also has moments of wisdom and generosity. The story you choose determines which of these multitudes gets activated in your presence. Dr. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset shows that when teachers, parents, or managers believe people can develop and improve rather than having fixed capabilities, those people actually do perform better over time. But this goes beyond individual achievement. Dr. Adam Grant's studies on giver behaviors show that when people believe others are fundamentally good and deserving of help, they create workplace cultures where cooperation and innovation flourish. David's relationship with his son Alex continued evolving. As David consistently held the story of Alex as a capable young man figuring out his path, Alex began living up to that story. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, but increasingly Alex started making choices that reflected the person David saw in him rather than the problem David had been trying to fix. Alex began taking more responsibility without being asked. He started coming to David for advice instead of avoiding conversations. He found a passion for environmental science and began organizing recycling programs at school. The same person, the same personality, but living inside a completely different story about who he was and what he was capable of. This fifth tiny decision, which story you choose about the people in your life, ripples outward in ways you may never fully trace. The child who grows up in the story of being naturally creative develops different confidence than the child in the story of being not artistic. The partner who lives in the story of being deeply loved and appreciated shows up differently than the partner in the story of being taken for granted. The stranger who encounters you carrying a story of their basic goodness and dignity has a slightly different day than the stranger who meets your assumption of their selfishness or incompetence. The ancient Greeks had a word, entelekchi, the realization of potential, the full actualization of what something can become. When you choose empowering stories about people, you participate in their entelekchi. You create conditions where their highest possibilities are more likely to emerge. This isn't about being naive or ignoring genuine problems. It's about recognizing that people are complex, multifaceted, and constantly becoming. The story you tell about them influences which aspects of their complexity get activated. But here's the ultimate butterfly effect of choosing empowering stories about others. It changes the story you tell about yourself. When you see others as capable of growth, you remember your own capacity for growth. When you see others as deserving of compassion for their struggles, you extend that same compassion to yourself. When you recognize the fundamental goodness in strangers, you reconnect with the fundamental goodness within yourself. This sixth tiny decision exists in this mirror space where the stories about others reflect back to become stories about yourself.
And the seventh? The seventh might be the most mysterious butterfly wing of all. It's the decision you're making right now, in this moment, about what all of this means, about whether these ideas will become passing thoughts or living practices, about who you're becoming as you listen. Because here's the secret the ancient storytellers knew. You are always in the middle of becoming the person you're going to be tomorrow. And the story you choose about this moment, about your capacity to grow, to change, to influence your world through tiny decisions, becomes the foundation for every choice you make next. So let's end where we began, but deeper now, with breath, with pause, with the recognition that right now, in this moment, you are both the butterfly and the wing, both the small cause and the great effect. And the story you choose about what happens next, well, that's entirely up to you. Here we are, at the end of our journey through the invisible architecture of change. 7 tiny decisions. Where you place your attention, how you inhabit the pause between stimulus and response, which stories you choose about your experiences, which stories you choose about other people, which story you choose about your own capacity for growth, and the 2 we've only touched on, the decision to trust the process of becoming, and the decision to see this moment as the only moment where change is actually possible. Take a breath with me now. A real one. In this breath, all 7 decisions live. Your attention, choosing to be here now. Your pause, creating space for intention rather than reaction. Your story about what this time together has meant. Your story about me, about yourself, about the invisible connections between all living things. Do you feel it? The butterfly wings starting to flutter? Not in some dramatic, life-changing revelation, but in the quiet recognition that you are always at the center of infinite possibility. That every moment, this moment, is both the result of countless tiny causes and the beginning of countless tiny effects. Maybe tomorrow morning, you'll notice the light in your window before you reach for your phone. Maybe you'll catch yourself in the pause before reacting to something frustrating. Maybe you'll choose a more empowering story about a difficulty you're facing, or about someone who's been challenging for you. These aren't grand gestures. They're barely noticeable shifts, butterfly wings. But now you know, the size of the cause has nothing to do with the magnitude of the effect. Somewhere tonight, there's a person who needed to hear exactly these words. A person lying awake, wondering if their small actions matter, if their life has meaning, if change is possible. Your choice to listen to this, to consider these ideas, to perhaps share them or live them, that choice ripples outward in ways you'll never trace, but will always matter. The ancient Zen master Dogen wrote, "Time is not separate from you, and as you are present, time does not go away." This moment, your listening, my speaking, the space between words, is not separate from eternity. It contains all the time there ever was or ever will be. And in this eternal now, butterfly wings are always fluttering. Tiny decisions are always cascading into transformed realities. Small choices are always becoming great changes. If you want to return to the space of calm whenever the world feels too loud, if you want more explorations into the quiet places where change is always possible, subscribe to The Quiet Mind. Because this isn't the end of our conversation. It's barely the beginning. The butterfly doesn't know that its wings create hurricanes. It simply flies, trusting the air to carry it forward. You don't need to know how your small choices will change the world. You only need to make them. Moment by moment, with the trust that everything is connected, everything matters, and you are always, always becoming. Rest well tonight. Tomorrow's butterfly wings are already stirring.